mask of character. This man lived 4,400 years ago, and he is the world's first great Semitic king. His name is Sargon of Akkad. And Sargon of Akkad is the first to establish what was later called the Fertile Crescent. Everything from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea was one kingdom, one swath. And his daughter, Edudama, is the authoress of Inanna, of all of the myths of Inanna. So you're reading Sargon of Akkad's daughter's book when you get your copy of Inanna. Now there is this Penguin Classics version, but it has only in it the descent into hell. All of the classic descents into hell that come from later world literature are all models of this. In other words, when we associate descents into hell with Dante, for instance, with a man going into the Inferno, and Dante tells us that his guide was Virgil, because Virgil in the Aeneid has Aeneas with the Cumaean Sibyl going into the underworld. And Virgil had as his guide Homer, because Homer in the Odyssey had Odysseus going into the underworld to find out via Circe how he could get the dead to tell him how he could get home. But even though Dante is 800 years ago, and Virgil is 1,300 years before that, and Homer is at least 1,000 years before that, well, more than 1,500 years before Homer comes Sargon's daughter, who wrote the original tale of people going into the underworld. And the authors since Dante are legion. The whole issue is that the essential mythic truth of the feminine, of a woman, is that she is free to go to the underworld to find her paired self. Because Inanna goes to the underworld to find her sister. Inanna is the queen of heaven, her sister is the queen of hell. But forget the word hell, because it's kind of misleading. Her sister is the queen of the underworld, she is the queen of the overworld. The two sisters form the 2 points. They're like the magnetic poles where the psychic energy of the world collect. And the link, which is an axis between those 2 poles, is the link of equilibrium by which the psychic shape is held. And that a world which needs to be renewed, you don't start by sweeping the dust, by jailing the vagabonds. You start by re-establishing the magnetic axis of the psyche, which is the truthfulness of the woman's soul. And because it has 2 poles, it has an overworld quality and it has an underworld quality, which need to be linked together. And until they're linked together, there's no magnetic axis in the world, and no way that psychic forms can keep their shape. And you can't do one thing if psychic forms can't keep their shape. Forget about ideas, which are symbolic psychic forms. You can't even keep ceremonies together. So when her father established the first really great world-class empire. What's a world-class empire? It's an empire that transcends completely the single cultural type, the single tribal people. What they called kingdoms before Sargon were like little areas the size of Santa Monica. And that king controlled that little area. The king of Santa Monica. And there were hundreds, if not thousands. Sargon is the first person in history to put together scores of these little empires, of these little kingdoms, and make of them a huge meta-kingdom. A real king of kings. Sargon is the first. In fact, he establishes the archetype of king of kings. And some 2,000 years after Sargon, the archetype king of kings activates, and the desire goes out that there should be another king of kings to set the world straight. Why does the world have to be set straight 2,000 years after Sargon? Because there got to be so many kingdoms that were about the size of Los Angeles County. But the same problem was there that in Sargon's time. How do you put all of those counties together? And the person who reactivated the archetype of King of Kings was Alexander the Great. And he established, again, on the basis of the Fertile Crescent of Sargon of Akkad, only he extended it further. He joined the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf together again for the first time since Sargon of Akkad. Only he included everything around the Mediterranean. Not only Palestine and Kole, Syria, and Egypt, but also Greece, Macedonia, everything else. And not only just the ports around the Persian Gulf, but all of the Persian Empire. All the way into Central Asia, all the way to India. But it was the same thing. It was Alexander the Great did what Sargon the Great did. And so we have this kind of interesting quality. In the very shape of the brain, we can see the same kind of structure. The sense of sight has a locus, the visual cortex area. The sense of hearing has its own location, where language comes together. And incidentally, different languages have slightly different areas of the brain. Japanese records further down the cortex, not that they're lower, from say French, which records further up. But the sense of smell does not have a localized area in the brain. The structure of the sense of smell is like a cross-section over the very top of the brain, the top. And it has exactly the same shape that the human body has. Starting in here at the chest, the shoulders, the arms, the hands, the toes. So that in a way, Sargon of Akkad's Fertile Crescent was like an original patterning, like the sense of smell, setting into the brain, the externalized brain, the social psyche of mankind, setting a pattern. And when the time came for renewing the world with Alexander the Great, he used the same pattern but enlarged it. And this is just the way that evolution happens. But there was no daughter of Alexander the Great to write an Inanna, a queen of heaven. And when asked, were there not learned people? Were there not men and women who understood this then? And the answer is, yes, there were. And they hung out in one place. They hung out in the new city of Alexandria. They hung out in the library. Because what the Library of Alexandria was for was to take the temperature of the psyche of the planet. Because Alexander wanted to have a one world. He said all human beings belong to one family, the ecumene. And we're not only going to have an empire that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, we're going to have a one world mankind. And so we need to learn about all the different tribes, all the different kingdoms, and bring them together into one whole fabric, and then put this pattern on that whole fabric, a single mankind. And so there were literary hotshots in Alexandria that tried to write the Inannas of their time. The greatest of them was Callimachus. The greatest Alexandrian poet was Callimachus. And he tried to write an epic that would do just that. It's not read much anymore. It wasn't read much at the time. Because instead of coming out of the feelings, instead of coming out of the world that actually existed, Callimachus used a mental prototype, and he wrote intellectually about how to do it. And it was a good model for literary criticism, and literary criticism flourished. But it did nothing for the people, for the culture, and so there was no ecumenical culture. And after Callimachus' generation, the whole Hellenistic world broke up again, just like congealing bad emulsion into the little kingdoms, only this time they were not so little, and each one of them had the pride of thinking that it was the heir to Alexander's empire. And the whole problem of nation-states warring against each other in the world dates exactly from that time. And it's still going on. And one says, is there not any kind of intelligence on the planet? What's interesting to us? The Penguin Classic Edition has the Descent into Hell, whereas the translation I'm recommending has the complete cycle of myths of Inanna. The difference in an education is that someone who is just speaking off the cuff, who's just getting you interested, will give you the descent, the Inanna's journey to hell. We'll just give you that, because of course that's the most important part. But the most important part is like a keystone. And a keystone lying on the ground by itself does not tell you as much as a keystone which is in place in an arch. Because when you see that the keystone holds the arch together, it's the shape of the arch that bears the weight. The keystone doesn't bear the weight. And it doesn't matter how fancy a keystone on the ground is, it doesn't bear any more weight than the guy who's standing on it. But a keystone in an arch will make the entire arch support something. Like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, built all on the principle of arches. And when you want to make a place where high wisdom lives, ever since the time of Sargon, the royal arch has been the very symbol of how this is done. And even third-hand rituals like Freemasonry have royal arch initiations. Still to this day. Why? Because they are truthful, because they are exacting, and because they work. So Inanna's descent into hell is just one. It's the keystone, but it's one stone. The keystone, but one stone, the center stone of a whole arch. We'd like to have the arch. And in fact, the arch consists of 5 separate stones. The first stone, and you'll get to read this, the Hulupu tree. Section 1, the Hulupu tree. And it starts on page 4. And so you get your copy of Inanna. And you can put a little mark in there, fold back the page if you like, that on page 4 starts the first stone. The second stone is on page 12. It starts, Inanna and the God of Wisdom. So we have something about a tree. Starts off with a tree. Something archetypal about a tree. Then there's something called the God of Wisdom that has a special relationship with Inanna. That's the second stone. And then the third stone is the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi. So she falls in love. She takes a lover. She takes a husband. Dumuzi. That's the third. Then the descent of Inanna is the fourth stone. And that, let's see, the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi is page 30. And then page 52 is the descent of Inanna, which is the major part of the story. And then the fifth stone are 7 hymns to Inanna that begin on page 93. The first hymn begins, I say hail to the Holy One who appears in the heavens. I say hail, hail to the Holy Priestess of heaven. I say hail to Inanna, great Lady of heaven, the Queen of heaven. Before there was a Virgin Mary, there was a Sophia. And before there was a Sophia, there was an Inanna. Now don't get carried away of thinking that the great goddess was back in Paleolithic times, because we're talking about psychic shapes that hold across an entire world, and there weren't any before this. There were local versions of this and that, but this is the first time that there was what we would call, in the skyscrapers of big cities today, something world class. It was written by a woman. Notice here that there are 5 stones that make up the arch of the myths of the royal heavenly woman. But if you count them, you notice that the descent into hell, the largest, the major piece, is the 4th stone. It's not the 3rd stone, it's not the middle stone. That the middle stone, using a kind of a Dennis Hopper type of inflection here, the 3rd stone is the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi. Her marriage is the center stone. And if you don't understand, like if you don't get the fact that the marriage is the center, not the descent into hell, you don't understand. No one understands at all. Because the central reality for a woman is not the underworld journey. That's the central reality for a man. That's what he's got to do. Even if he's Luke Skywalker, he's got to go down there where Yoda says, don't go down there. What's down there? Fear is down there. Well, what do I fear? Whatever you fear, that's what's there. Take your pick. Whoa, did you imagine anything? What did you do, Ray? I imagined something I thought would never terrorize us. The Stay Puft Marshmallow. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, that's what's there, and that is fearful. I'm mixing my movies. It's Jello. There's no increase in price for this. What's important is that when we look at structure, when we learn to count, just simply counting, when we become numerate, not just literate. Literate is something else that's very difficult to become literate, but to become numerate, numeracy precedes literacy. You have to learn to count. The central stone and the arch of the myth of Inanna is her marriage to Dumuzi. So when you read the myth of Inanna, don't skip over that and go to the descent of Inanna to the underworld. And maybe it's not such a good idea to buy the Penguin Classic then. maybe it's a good idea to get the complete cycle of the myths and to maybe take a sheet of paper and write those 5 out and then read each section in whatever order you want, but enter in some ideas, some impressions, some thoughts, some quotes under each of those sections. So that if you read the 7 hymns of Inanna first, make 7 little lines, and then on each of the 7, under the 5th stone, make little notes for yourself. Why? Because we're trying to be conscious now that we're studying myth, and that there isn't a single myth, but all myths link together. They all have rhizomes that link together, and they link together in what's called a mythology. That each individual myth, by its own very nature, links with other myths that go together with it until they form a complete cycle. Why is this so? The Greek understanding of the word, and the word is Greek, mythos. It means a story. Something that has a beginning and something that has an end. And in between the beginning and the end is some kind of a middle that minimally is 1 part, sometimes is 2 parts, but it seems in the world of storytelling very optimally there are 3 middle parts. So there's a beginning, then there's a beginning complication, there's the apex of what's happening, there's the beginning of the end, and then there's the end. 5. Where have we run across this as a universal form? The 5-phase energy cycle of Taoism. Tao, Te, Gen, Yi, Li. Or 0, 1, 2, 3, infinity. Once you have this universal form, once you understand that this is the process that always happens, not because they say so, not because she says so, not because he says so, but because in the experience of human beings who look before they leap, who taste before they swallow, who listen to hear before they believe, in that kind of indelible openness to actual experience, men and women for all time on this planet have come to understand that there is a structure to the shape of experience which holds. There are many, many threads of existence which translate into arcs of experience, but almost all of those arcs of experience evaporate like little ponds in a desert. They do not hold. The rivers that are there year-round, the lakes that never dry up, are there because there are structures of human experience which are indelible. Now they may be different on planets around other stars. I tend to doubt it. But on this planet, around this star, this is how it works. So that there is a quality in myth. And the quality in myth, like the fabric of a cloth, you have to be able to touch existence to find out what it is. And when you touch existence, the finding out is the experience of it. Myth has everything to do with experience. Where ritual had everything to do with existence, myth has everything to do with experience. Ritual has to do with oneness. Existence is what is. But experience has a double quality. It has a comparative quality. It has a this and that. So experience, myth, always has to do with 2. So that when you look for the archetypal apex of a mythic cycle, it's always where the 2 come together. For Inanna, because she's healthy young woman, it's her marriage. But there are many ways one has to see this deeper. Experience is about the pairedness, which is the true characteristic hidden in the one. Why is pairedness hidden in the one? It's the first question on the final exam. Why is two always hidden in the one, and what does that mean anyway? Remember that the one is one. It has its oneness because it is distinct from zero. If there were not a zero base, one would have no form. Without the Tao, Te doesn't happen. Te is real because Tao is zeroly real. And because the zero is always implicit in the one, there's always a zero with the one, in the one, and that's the two. And so the two experience always brings the Tao and the Te together. That's why when Lao Tzu writes about the Tao and the Te, he calls it a Qing, a book. Because experience is all about Tao, Te, Qing. And when you got the Qing, when you've read the book, then you develop that human-heartedness which experience brings out of us, the Jin. And that's where Confucius begins his philosophy, not with the Tao, not with the Te. Why reinvent the wheel? The old man already got that down. Lao Tzu was at least 3 generations older than Confucius. And so Confucius began his discussion of philosophy with Jen, with human-heartedness. Not because he ignored the Tao and the Te, but they'd already been handled. Why reinvent the wheel? Experience has to do with the way in which the hidden pairedness in unity comes into play and makes experience very interesting. Not just amusing, not just entertaining, but truly profoundly interesting. And experience, in its primordial happening, is what language is all about. Telling somebody. Do you know what happened to me? Can you imagine? The need to tell somebody and the need to listen to somebody else. What happened to you? What was your experience? All of our lives, we were born, we die, but things happen to us in between. Lo and behold, what happens to us in between is the structure, the myth, the mythos of our life. That life itself, human life, what we have, follows a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that life itself is a mythic structure of experience. Well, who wouldn't be interested in that, especially since we are involved in that? Indelibly, we can't, where are we going to be other than there? Whatever else we know will come out of that. That's the source. It's like I remember Lee Strasberg one time complaining about the 2-bit new actors who had no experience of their own to draw on. They remembered how other people did those roles and they did versions of them. He said there are a lot of stick Marlon Brandos walking around parading. But they don't pull anything out of themselves because there's nothing there. They're not interesting. And when an actor comes along who has something of interest and pulls it out of themselves, do you think Harrison Ford is wondering how Marlon Brando would have done it? How would he have played Han Solo? No, he never thought of it at all. been a waste of time. And so experience can never be a surrogate. Surrogate experience is not experience. It's something else. You have to have your own experience. And so an education is not that the teacher gives their experience to the student. That's not going to do anybody any good at all. That would be boring. Somebody once in this room, in all seriousness, thought that I should be proud of a future where I could be cloned. Well, I didn't know what to say. I mean, on the boulevard, we say, no shit, to those kinds of things. I mean, I can hardly believe it. That should be a desirable purpose. Strasberg would have taken off his glasses and polishing them and nervously around and then, stormed down. Wasting my time. That's what it was. Experience, myth, language. This is what we're looking at, and we're beginning today to look at it. But there's something which is so excruciatingly baffling about experience, about language, about myth. What is it that's excruciating? Is that there is a hidden structure operating in it, almost autonomous vis-a-vis the content. Vis-a-vis any kind of superficial shapes that we think are there. That lurking underneath, profoundly, is a real shape, a structure of rivers that are there year-round, and they do not dry up. Whereas the imputed shapes to experience that come from shallow experience, those rivers dry up. There will be dry seasons in your life if you're hoping to get water from those kinds of rivers. Whereas if you build your life, if you camp out on rivers of structure that are there year-round, you will never perish, though the world is a true desert. I have an example. I have a crazy example, and it's the way to lead into Plato. Because along with Inanna, because we never just do anything simple, we pair with Inanna Plato's Phaedus. We always have a pair of texts. Somebody once said that when they were young, they used to carry James Joyce's Ulysses as a talisman under their arm, sign of coming to age. That's like little versions of the Marlon Brando thing. Just reading James Joyce and looking at the world with that kind of a model, you're never going to develop your own experience. We're not saying don't appreciate Marlon Brando, don't read James Joyce, but we're saying in order to do an end run around that kind of clone feeding trough idiocy, we pair texts together so there's no chance of doing that. So we pair Plato's Phaedrus. Why the Phaedrus? Why Plato? We're going to get to that in just a minute. In fact, why wait? Let's get to it now. I wrote it out because it's the other side of the argument, and I want to be sure and deliver it right. The spirit of Professor Weinberg is with me. His comment would have been, "You're becoming a philosopher at last." 35 years in school. Keep reading, my boy. Keep reading. Exhibit A is this set of 5 volumes. Big set. What has this set of 5 volumes got to do with anything? This is The linchpin. Other than keystones, there are linchpins. You know what a linchpin is? We don't know anymore. When you have an axle, and you have the wheels on the axle, in order to keep the wheel on the axle, you have a linchpin. This is the linchpin in the presentation of why Plato is indelibly important and needs to be paired with Inanna. Well, I don't want you to just take it on face value that, well, he spent a long time choosing these things and sifting through. They must go together. Well, geez, they must go together, right? Well, why? This 5-volume set is entitled The Beginnings of Christianity. It's not a history of Christianity. It's a history of one book, the Acts of the Apostles. Two of the greatest theologians in England realized that after 50 years of biblical scholarship, that there was so much that nobody knew, and were unsure about everything, that they put together all the greatest scholars in the world at that time in biblical scholarship in the English language to write a 5-volume study of the one book, the Acts of the Apostles, as a document then that could be looked at with some kind of fullness as the first document to read in a projected history of Christianity that who knows when it would ever be written or could be written. In the first volume, at the very end of it, are 5 little appendixes, and I chose Appendix E, the 5th appendix, to just bring something out. Here's how I wrote it. Let me just read it and then we'll take a break. In a seminal work of 5 volumes that was issued from 1920 to 1933, entitled The Beginnings of Christianity, the Acts of the Apostles, there exists an appendix, Appendix E, to Volume 1. Its title is The Amha-Ares, A-M-H-A-A-R-E-S, the Amha-Ares, which means the people of the land, and the Habarim, meaning the associates. So Appendix E is all about 2 kinds of people, the Amha-Ares and the Habarim, the masses and the learned. It's by George Foot Moore, a famous biblical scholar whose life work was understanding how Jewish traditions and lore came in and illuminated Protestant theological insights. He was at Harvard. The term Amha-Ares meant the masses, somewhat like the term Goy, meaning heathen, usually Gentile heathens. Heathen because they thought that they were an offshoot of Judaism, like Christians, when in fact they knew not much at all about Jewish tradition, even less about learning, and much less about real, mature learning, such as one achieves with study, for instance, under a legitimate rabbi. The Habarim were those students and were members of an association, the Habura, somewhat of a congregation connected to a particular rabbi at a particular synagogue. Our interest is in the clear 4-part stages which characterize the progressive decline from the Habar down through the Amha-Ares and further. This typology had nothing to do with classes of wealth, but rather with classes of purity. Classes of purity in relation to God. In relation, that is, to learning about and really understanding the full relation to God that experience is capable of, that actually can be found to exist. Thus, the typology was kept well ordered by rituals of rules and actions, like the rules about partaking of unclean food. Somebody who was a Habar, a part of a Habura, could not buy food in the open market unless you really knew who was selling it, because it might potentially be unclean. And your purity would be compromised. The typology was in four parts. The highest was the Haber, who studied both scripture and Mishnah, which is a kind of commentarial exegesis, with a rabbi in a Habura context. If you studied with a rabbi of this synagogue, then you were a member of that congregation. Second was a person who studied scripture and the Mishnah, but not at the feet of a rabbi. And these were the Am Ha-Ares. But those are the two highest classes. There are two lower classes yet than that. The third was a person who read the scripture, but never read the Mishnah, never read any commentarial exegesis, and never studied with a rabbi. And they were called bores, B-O-R, just like a boar. Oh, he's a boar. So you have the Haber, the Am-Ha-Aretz, and the bores. And the fourth level were people that not only didn't study with rabbis, and did not read scripture and Mishnah, but didn't even read scripture, and these were the beasts, the brute heathens. 4-part typology. And of course the typology extended only to men. Women were outside this schemata, a sort of fifth wheel, unofficio status in terms of Torah and Yahweh. George Foot Moore quotes from rabbinic literature, the Tosefta Barakov 7:18, where a rabbi thanks God that he did not create him a heathen, a woman, or a boor. And of course, slaves were outside this typology too, so that slaves and women sort of faded into the background, and they were outside of even this typology that ended with the brute heathens, the lowest one. A little note here. Peter's dismissal of Mary Magdalene indicates an ongoing problem for even the Roman rabbis' rule. Curiously, the rabbinic typology owes its etiology to the world context ambience that is sourced in Plato, of all people. The rabbis rejected Hellenistic Judaism. 90 AD, Council of Jamnia. We're not going to talk about that anymore, ever. That's it. Rejecting Hellenistic Judaism, the Council of Jamnia could not sieve completely the atmosphere of Plato's structure, which has so permeated the ancient world after 500 years of influence and distribution and permutation, as to be virtually undetectable as an alien element. It was hidden as a structural symbolism always is, well below the manipulable levels of worldly content and worldly shape. And in fact, this is the very point of the typology in the first place. There were no Jewish typologies in classical Judaism at all. It is a Greek, it is a Platonic characteristic to have typologies in the first place. So we have a paradox here. The highest achievement needs a deep education and is radically different from an uneducated person of no attainment. In Plato, the lowest level is the brute who learns nothing but insists always on just having his opinion. The word of this kind of opinion in Greek is doxa, from which we get finally doxology. Can you imagine? And so when a Protestant congregation prides itself on its being able to recite its doxology, it flies in the teeth of 2,500 years of wisdom, even just that. The lowest level has just doxa. The second level has informed opinion, doxa alethes. But beyond that is episteme, knowledge, real knowledge which is shared among people. Not only have you an opinion, but you have a true opinion because you've looked into things, read things. And not only have you read things, but you've discussed it with people. And so doxa goes up to doxa alethes, goes up to episteme. But there's something beyond that called truth, called aletheia. Aletheia. And aletheia is when you are educated by a philosopher who awakens in you recognition. Because truth is truth not because somebody else says it, but because you recognize it. So despite rejection, Plato infused rabbinic typology indelibly. For before the rabbinic Platonism, the Jewish tradition recognized only one way to that truth, that God would send a prophet to interpret the Torah for a new time. Before there were rabbis in that typology, there were only prophets to interpret the law. In fact, it is just this Reformation which Muhammad claimed for himself vis-a-vis a degenerate Christianity and Judaism of his time, that God had sent a new prophet, Muhammad, to reinterpret the law of God for a new time. Islam is a reactionary reformation of Judaism, quite in keeping with the ancient Jewish tradition. I'll make copies of this so you can get this. It's rather convoluted. Mm-hmm. I guess we need a drink. Been doing this a long time, so I've prepared a lot of material. I've done 27 lectures in a series of several parts on Plato, so that there are 2 sets of 13 lectures each, and then a 27th lecture called Plato's Theory of Education. And I did these in order to try and make sense out of the whole work of Plato for somebody who would be interested. And for the Phaedus the Phaedrus rather, is one of the most interesting of all of Plato's dialogues. And for each of Plato's dialogues, major dialogues, I did a little pamphlet, and I went through the argument of the dialogue, so that with this pamphlet and with the hour-and-a-half cassette lecture, anybody from scratch can follow any of the major dialogues of Plato. And you can put together any number of cassettes and any number of pamphlets, and you could master all of Plato if you wanted to, and even get an overview on what all this was about. But I mention it because I won't have time here to go into the Phaedrus in depth, so if you're reading the Phaedrus, there is a cassette on the Phaedrus that presents it complete with good Xerox and accompanying pamphlet. And if you don't have time to just struggle on your own with the Phaedrus, because you should read the Phaedrus. Just like we should read all of Inanna, the whole cycle. The little blurb in the Philosophic Research Society pamphlet, which characterized the Phaedrus, reads as follows, if you can imagine. The great conversation about love. It's a conversation about love. About love as the beginning of understanding, by which we should seek the beyond. Love is the beginning of the understanding by which we can seek the beyond. So it's not surprise all that somebody will imagine it to be. I mean, it's not like, oh, geez, he's making us read Greek philosophy. That may be your opinion coming in. But hopefully, you're able to undergo a transform and stick with it long enough so that you begin to feel the bones of what's real holding you up in your life. That's what this education is all about. To let the bones of the real come through so that your posture of life is more mobile and more capable than it would be otherwise. And unfortunately, there's no way to get it in a weekend retreat. Or any number of weekend retreats. Those are like the little Santa Monica kingdoms. They don't add up to anything. They granulate. And they produce an addictive taste for more of them. And of course, people pushing the product love to have you have that taste. It sells more cigarettes. But we're not just reading Plato. We're pairing the Phaedus with Inanna as the beginning pair. And there are going to be 3 pairs which open up the whole world of what myth is all about, of what language does, of what experience is when you're able to really feel it. And experience is about the intelligence of feeling. And if we don't have any realistic feeling intelligence about experience, our thought will never be clear. Thought cannot resolve itself without a substrate of feeling intelligence about experience. Which in a kind of a jumbled folk wisdom, misplaced motto, people say, well, so-and-so only went to college and never learned anything about life. It's that kind of thing. One has to be more refined about it than just sporting little mottos. In order for thinking to resolve itself, to have shapes of ideas that hold and are real, and objectively there, feeling shapes have to have some way to exist in our experience and maintain themselves and be shareable. In mathematics, it's called the commutative. And if experience is not commutative, and how is it commutative? Through its shapes of myth. And that's the whole reason why myth never goes out of date. Just as we saw, ritual has nothing to do with superstition, myths have nothing to do with half-truths. Nothing. Something is not a myth because it's half true and half untrue. That's not it at all. That's doxa. That's not even doxa alethes. Much less somebody's episteme, which is completely radically distant from truth. Truth is meaning accepted. The acceptance is what cinches it and makes it true. And the acceptance is not a belief, but a recognition. Truth is always recognized. One knows that's true. How? Because you knew before. Before what? Before this life. That's what it's all about. And someone who cannot lead to the veracity of recognition is just another song and dance act. And no one can put theirs into you. And so the new age supersonic guru that's going to enlighten you for prosperity and better life and better times this weekend somewhere, it's just a bag of sand. It's ballast. And the sooner you duff it, the better your mobility. Let's come to the Phaedus. But let's come to the Phaedus in a kind of a structured way. We're pairing the Phaedus with Inanna as the first of three pairs. Now we talked about how myth is a beginning, a middle, and an end. A mythos has this storyline, so that language always, in its forms, no matter what level of forms, always has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that one even coming to some kind of mechanical reductive stereotype of the sentence of meaningful language would say that it's a syllogism, as Aristotle did, that has this premise, this, and it has a conclusion. The premise, the predicate, the conclusion. That this is the form by which language works. But Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher for 20 years, is more subtle. And Aristotle didn't see the need of reinventing the wheel. He knew that everybody who would read him would read Plato, probably read Plato first. So he never made a big issue out of it. But he understood that too. When Plato wishes to bring something really important, he places a myth there. Do you remember Basho? Basho who? One of the texts that we just looked at just a few weeks ago for a whole month. Basho's Zen travelogue. And when he gets to a certain point and he doesn't want to give you surrogate experience, he stops the prose and puts a haiku in right there. And the haiku presents the Zen moment of existence. When Plato wants to present the Zen moment of experience, he stops the philosophic dialogue and conversation and puts a myth in there. Myths in Plato work like haiku and basho. That's simple. That's even like a string around a finger, right? Why does Plato have myths? For the same reason that basho has haiku. Plato's prose, though, is a narrative that develops as a response between at least two, and usually 3 or 4 different people. A conversation, a dialogue. A dialogue. It's a journal that's kept as a record of a conversation, so that Plato's dialogues are like the journals of a conversation. And when the conversation gets to a certain juncture of poignancy, instead of continuing the dialogue, Plato stops the dialogue and puts a myth in there. The Phaedus has the best myths in all of Plato. The most famous myth occurs in the dialogue called the Republic, the myth of the cave. But the Phaedus has several fantastically beautiful myths. And they're the philosophic haiku that have been presentational touchstones for at least 2,400 years. Still are today. The pair of Plato's Phaedrus with Inanna, then, is the beginning of our look at myth. because the myths in the Phaedrus, the myths of Inanna, go together in such a way that they disclose for us the true nature of mythic experience, the way in which language works. And that's the beginning of our excursion into myth. This pair. Well, what's the third pair? What's the last pair? The last pair are two books written about the nature of myth in the most deepest, profound way. One is called Language and Myth by Ernst Cassirer. The other is called Myth and Reality by Mircea Eliade. They both have myth in the title. One has language, the other has reality. So if they have something to do with language and reality, and how language and reality are mediated by myth. So that Plato and Inanna begin our study of myth. Mircea Eliade and Ernst Cassirer, Language and Myth, Myth and Reality, concluded what's in the middle? What's the complication that develops? What's the middle part of the story? What's the meat of the story? The pair of books are the Book of Daniel from the Old Testament and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, written in the 14th century in the Midlands of England. That there's something about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight written around the time that Chaucer was a mature man. And the Book of Daniel, written by the teacher of righteousness, who's the founder of the Qumran Essene community, written about 150 BCE. And even though they're about 1,500 years apart, they work together in this context because the Book of Daniel is all about dream interpretation. And dreams have a specific quality vis-a-vis myths. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the most refined of all of the Arthurian myths. And at a time when it was written, the high medieval was just beginning to make its transition to the early Renaissance. The transitional figure is Chaucer. And the last and best of the old were the high medieval love visions of dreams. The dream visions of love were the highest development of medieval literature. In fact, there's a Penguin classic of Geoffrey Chaucer's Love Visions. I'll show you a copy next week. And a lot of the great literature of that age were all about dream visions, about love. So that the Book of Daniel being about dreams, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight being an Arthurian myth about love, the essential, real nature of love, from the aspect of the masculine that is challenged by the mystery of love. Inanna's mystery of love survives 4,000 years and comes up as the essential hidden structure of the challenge to Sir Gawain. And we pair Sir Gawain with Daniel because there's something about being able to mature dream analysis to the point of visionary exactness on a world scope. The Book of Daniel teaches people. It's a workbook, an Essene workbook in dream analysis. How do you analyze dreams? And how do you deepen the analysis of dreams so that you can analyze not only your own dreams, but someone else's dreams? And how do you deepen the analysis of someone else's dreams so that you can analyze waking dreams, which are visions? And then finally, how can you analyze a world-class vision of the transformation at the end of time that applies to all people? So the Book of Daniel is that kind of a workbook. Sir Isaac Newton spent the last 30 years of his life trying to figure out the structure of the Book of Daniel vis-a-vis the Book of Revelation. because he knew, being a very smart boy, that there's something about those two books that go together. And he was exactly right, but he didn't know why. Just off the cuff, since I know, the book of Daniel is by the teacher of righteousness who founds the Qumran community, and the Apocalypse, the book of righteousness, is mostly by John the Baptist, who is the last figure in the Qumran community. So between the teacher of righteousness and John the Baptist, in that 200 years, you have the development of the Essene archetype of purity. It's the context out of which Jesus steps. That's why they go together. Well, they always will go together. And they are both balanced, esoterically, upon the archetypal vision of Ezekiel. But that's another story. If we start with Inanna and Plato's Phaedus and go through the book of Daniel and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and end up with language and myth and reality, Ernst Cassirer and Mircea Eliade, we will have begun with something very ancient and traditional, gone through a median development in the millennia in between, and come to the 20th century. And when we have done that, we will be able to conclude our excursion into myth, into language, into experience with interval number 3, Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus, which is, how can I use the language? I use Hollywood language. It's the ace, Jim Crack pinnacle of the way in which a 20th century mystic tells us how a mythic figure like Orpheus is absolutely real. Now, Rilke says, in one part, paraphrasing him, but how can I walk through that mystical space where the tree of life left its impress and left, and only the space is left? How can a man walk through that? It's easy for a god to do. So the 13 weeks of looking at myth, if you'll just lend yourself to it, will have its structure, it will have its movement, it will have its richness. But it's a richness that you can't guess at. It's a richness not that somebody has an opinion, oh, well, it's good or not. It's not a richness that you can just discuss and come to some determination of what it is. It isn't doxa, it isn't doxa aletheia, it isn't even episteme. It's an aletheia that will be there if it's accepted and just taken in. Because the final stage of integration is acceptance. And if we do this, our excursion through myth will deliver us into a position for the first time to be able to look at symbols, to be able to look at thought, to be able to look at the mind in such a way that our integrity of feeling will feel enough love in our visionary capacity to see the mind in terms of itself, to experience thought as thought, and not as some surrogate manipulation. For if we don't come into possession of our own minds, other people who make up beautifully powerful ideologies will take over that thought function from us. If we don't have it, it will be taken from us. It's not an idle threat. It happens one way or the other. Either you come in possession of your own mind, and you think the thoughts that you need to think, or you will fall prey, become fodder for somebody else's very powerful ideology. And as a longshoreman in San Francisco named Eric Hoffer wrote one time in a book called The True Believer, he said, the true believer is on the march everywhere, and he's ready to convince you to die for his cause. And you will, unless you can make the proper distinctions at the right time. It's like she said, there's a time to say no. And you better say it when the time is there. Let's come to the Phaedrus, because the Phaedrus is all about this. The Phaedrus is the only Platonic dialogue that does not take place in the city. It takes place outside the city of Athens. In other words, this is an unusual thing for Plato, that this philosophic conversation is so delicate that it could not be held in the city. It has to be held outside the city gates. In fact, Socrates and Phaedrus, who have this conversation, go outside the city because Socrates sees Phaedrus with a kind of a dazed look upon his face. He's carrying something rolled up under his arm. And Socrates, being a real world-class teacher, says, "Oh, Phaedrus, you must have just been to hear Lysis talking about the spirit of love, haven't you? That's why you have that dazed look about your face. And you're carrying under the arm the transcript of Lysis' speech, don't you?" "Yes," Phaedrus said. "How did you know, Socrates?" Socrates says, "Well, it's version. I've been around a long time, Phaedrus. I've known you since you were born. I know what kind of a boy you are. And you're interested in love, aren't you? And you heard Lysis because he's one of the most famous of all the sophists of the day. And he's talking about, in a radical, clever new way, that in love, it's not the lover who means it that is the best lover, but it's the lover who doesn't mean it. It's a clever, novel twist. It's making Lysis the most talked about, famous guy in town. It's a new twist. It isn't what we thought at all. It's completely different. Well, Phaedrus says, "Well, Socrates, are you criticizing Lysis? Do you know what he said?" And Socrates says, "Well, you're quite right, Phaedrus. I don't know what he said, and I would welcome this opportunity if you could tell me what he said. Just recount the argument to me. Let's go outside of town and let's go alongside this, is it the Ilissus River? With a nice big plane tree there." And Socrates says, "In fact, Phaedrus, this is a very famous spot. This is one of the most famous spots in all of the mythic realm around the Attic Greeks. Attica being the county, the province, where Athens is." He says, "You know, this is the place where they say that the cicadas live. And the cicadas sing from their moment of birth to their moment of death. They are born singing and they sing their entire lives until they die. And so the cicadas are a specific kind of creature. They never take food. They never take water. The only nourishment they have is the nourishment of the spirit. And they spend their entire lifespan singing praises to God on food of the spirit. And that this is the very spot in which that was first recognized and understood. And this is a very good place for us to sit and talk about the spirit of love." Now, what did Lysis say? And to encourage him, Socrates says, quotes Pindar, and he says to him, "You know, when human beings, when men especially, talk about love, it's so important that it's above all business. It's more important than business." So let's be honest, Phaedrus. Tell me about this. After they go through this, Phaedrus gets Socrates to tell his version, and Socrates makes up a version about love. And when he's finished, because he's outdone Lysis, Socrates' spiel about love is even more clever than Lysis, even more radical, and even more baloney. And Socrates catches himself and he says, "Phaedrus, I have to stop here, and I have to be utterly honest with you. I've just uttered a falsehood to you. I've told you an untrue hypothetical spiel. And he says, because when I was a young man, my teacher, Diotima, who was a woman, Socrates' teacher was a woman, Diotima awakened in me a certain deep spirit, called in Greek a daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N, demon. And she awakened this personal genius in me, this personal demon in me, this personal spirit in me, that does not really allow me to know anything in particular, but it allows me instantly to know when I've uttered an untruth. And since she awakened that in me, I have spent my whole life trying to understand what this is and how it works, and if other people have it, and why don't they have it, and why do I have it. And it's not that I know anything more than other men, but that I know when I don't know. And so what's born is the notion here of Socratic ignorance. It's not that you know something that other people don't know, but that you know that you don't know. You know when there's a gap there. You know when there's a hole in your understanding. And Socrates says, Phaedrus, because I've had this all my life, I'm always searching to really find out what is true. Because the only thing that fills that gap is truth. The other things like doxa, opinion, don't fill it. They are like, sand in between the bread. It's not a real nourishing food. Opinion doesn't do it. And informed opinion doesn't do it. It's like it stretches the opinion, and it's sort of like pasted together, and it's like a quilt of easily tearable fragments. And that through long experience, I found, Socrates says, that even episteme, even knowledge, does not fill the gap. Only truth fills that gap, only aletheia. And so what I'm after is not simply knowing about things, episteme, but I'm after truth. What is the truth at the bottom of any issue that we can ever talk about? Because it doesn't matter where we start, what we talk about. All these are on sort of the rim of a whole circle. All of the possibilities that we could talk about are a huge circle. And as we go deeper in, no matter where we start in that circle, there's only one center. And it's only the center that covers this gap, and the spirit in me allows me to rest. I cannot rest because the whole has been awakened in me by my teacher. And I must find the truth. And the only way I've found to go deeper and deeper is to have these conversations with other people. I can't have them by myself because I don't know. But I have found a method by which I can converse with anybody about anything and progressively go deeper enough to find the truth. And that's what I do. And that's what I have done. And that's what we would like to do, Phaedrus. We would like to find the truth about love. And the only way we can do this is not listening to some sophist tell us about it, or me outdo the sophist by making something up, but only by you and I talking, profoundly serious, limpidly real, between us, can we progress and find if there is a truth about love. Are you willing to do that, Phaedrus? And Phaedrus says, Socrates, I love this sort of thing more than anything else. And Socrates says, my boy, that's why we're here, because I know that about you. I knew your father, I know you. You are relentlessly trustworthy to never give up. And you're just exactly the right companion. And together, let us find out what the truth is about love. And they discover that the truth about love is that love is a spirit, a living spirit. Not a principle. Not something distant. but a living spirit that inhabits only one place, the center of the soul. Socrates says, Phaedrus, it's so important before we begin this conversation. Let's pay attention to an ancient tradition. Let's purify ourselves. Before two human beings really can have this extended, in-depth conversation about something of spiritual poignancy, we have to purify ourselves. He says there's an ancient mode of language, an ancient form of language that we Greeks have. It was put together by a poet named Stesichorus. And this mode was not known to Homer, but was found by Stesichorus. Because Stesichorus lost the sight of both eyes, the gods took away his sight, because he had written a poem in which he said that the whole complication of the Trojan War and all of the gods was all imagination due to Helen being a bad person. And that because of this defamation, the gods took away the sight of Stesichorus. Because the whole point of the Trojan War is not the guilt or the innocence of Helen. The whole point of it is about the hubris of man, that he can, by force, make destiny yield to his power. And without understanding that point, with thinking that it has to do with whether Helen was virtuous or not, leads people away from this most important part. So the gods took away the sight of Stesichorus. But when he learned that if he shaped language in such a way that it disclosed the real, that it took false language and put false language into such a form that by continuing to use it, it became true language. Because of discovering that, the gods gave sight back to Stesichorus. And Stesichorus found the form by which even false language can be distilled into true language. Because he had to. And the form of this language is called the palinode. Palinode. And his first palinode, the palinode of Stesichorus, is devoted to Helen. To not only clear her, but to clear himself. And it's a palinode to love. That what she did had something to do with the reality of love. The spirit of love. And has nothing to do with worldly blame, with men's clever or not so clever ideas of blame, but has to do with love and its truth. Socrates says, after he gives this discourse by Stesichorus, he says, Phaedrus, one of the greatest blessings to men is the blessings of a certain type of madness that comes from the gods. The kind of madness that's there at Delphi, when the seer, the Sibyl of Delphi, in her madness, sitting upon the tripod above the chasm in the earth, and the vapors of the underworld come up and suffuse the young, usually it's an adolescent girl about 12, 13 years old. The pure adolescent, virginal girl comes into contact with the vapors of the underworld and suffuse her in such a way that the whole energy pull of the psyche shoots from the underworld through the focus of the virginal Sibyl, shoots through her to a high prophetic language, feminine language at the very crest of the overworld. So that the Sibyl is like a prism who focuses this mysterious language energy from the underworld, but doesn't come to focus in her, it comes to focus in the utterance, the prophecies. And Socrates knows this well because his teacher, Diotima, after she was finished awakening him in order to cinch it so that he would never forget, said, Socrates, you need to go to the Oracle of Delphi. And the Oracle of Delphi will tell you what is true about you. You will know the truth of your... And when he went there, the Delphic Oracle uttered only 2 words to him. Know thyself. That was it. But because of the fruitful mulching of his psyche by Diotima, Socrates was able to understand that relentlessly he had to find out what know thyself meant. That was his whole career of being Socrates. He says, when we look for the motives behind action, like love, we have to realize that at some depth there will be a first mover. There'll be a first principle. There'll be a source. And what will be characteristic about that source is that it will not be moved by anything other than itself, and so we could call it self-moved. It has a motion of itself and not from anything else, but it imparts its self-motion to other levels, and they are moved. Now, this self-mover will have something to do with the spirit of love, that the spirit of love is the archetype of the self-moved reality in truth. And that when people are in love, it is absolutely recognizable to them that their love is pure because it is this self-moved quality. No one else caused this. Especially a good-looking other person didn't cause this. They were only the trigger that snapped us awake to the recognition level, and in our recognition we realized that because the self-moved spirit was alive in us, that this was a love experience. Phaedus says, well, Socrates, if this is true, how do people not know this? If it were that simple and that indelible, everyone would know this. But it's very rare. Almost no one knows this. Socrates says, well, you know, the soul has wings, Phaedus. Wings that can be shed. And when we live in a false way, we lose our wings. We're not able to fly in this rarefied realm where love is real. All soul, he says, all soul, which is besouled by itself, has this quality of bringing into union a pair of motions, like 2 horses to a chariot. One of these horses is wild passion, and one of these horses is even-paced reason. And only love can bring these 2 horses into union so that a single chariot could be driven. But it takes a very savvy driver, a charioteer, in order to manage these 2 horses, passion and equilibrium together. Only a very wise charioteer can do this. And so the myth of the chariot is one of the first myths in the Phaedrus. I think it would be interesting if you could read it for yourselves. So when you go to find your Phaedrus, and you'll notice that there are like little numbers on the side, usually in these translations. So we need to go to 245. The little numbers in the side. Just go to that section and you can start. In fact, you can start at the 244e, the paragraph before. Here's how it reads in Plato, so you can find it. This is in the Bulletin translation. And in the second place, when grievous maladies and afflictions have beset certain families by reason of some ancient sin, madness has appeared among them, and breaking out into prophecy has secured relief by finding the means thereto, namely, by recourse to prayer and worship. In other words, very often, where experience is taxed to an ultimate and its capacity to hold stability is transcended, the way to come back into a management of that is to go back to the level of ritual, worship, and prayer, and work one's way up again from there to experience. Go back to existence and come back into experience through a renewed contact with existence. This is what Socrates is saying to Phaedrus. This is one of the ways, one of the possibilities. And if you do a manipulated ritual, it's not going to work. Because the manipulation of the ritual is going to come from some ideological structure that has nothing to do with your feeling reality. And you will feel manipulated. And you will be even worse off than you were before. Instead of being a neurotic, which is trying to find a way to get out of the neurosis, you become a psychotic. This is why it is absolutely perilous to have manipulated ceremonies. Ceremonies that do not come from the existence, do not awaken the heart. And anyone can tell, because there's no recognition of oneself in a false ceremony. None whatsoever. And it does more harm to do those than to do. But Socrates says, there is a third form of possession or madness, of which the muses are the source. This seizes a tender virgin soul and stimulates it in rapt, passionate expression, especially in lyric poetry, glorifying the countless mighty deeds of ancient time for the instruction of posterity. But if any man comes to the gates of poetry without the madness of the muses, persuaded that skill alone will make him a good poet, then shall he and his works of sanity with him be brought to naught by the poetry of madness, and behold, their place is nowhere to be found. Now notice that in language, in myth, poetry holds a soul-centered place. Poetry has a lot to do with myth. What does it have to do? Poetry is the soul center of the mythic arch. And it's like one of the most archetypal, archaic of all the structures. At the time of Sargon of Akkad lived Zarathustra in northeast, what is now Iran, about 4,300 years ago. Zarathustra said that the arch of royal language is what Mazda is, and at the center at the apex of the holy space created by this arch is Ahura, who gives the blessing of truthful language. And so Ahura Mazda allows for the focus of the royal arch of language through the genius of poetic expression to deliver truth to human beings. Plato remembers in the Phaedrus that whole archetypal capacity. Plato lives about 2,000 years after Zarathustra and holds a very similar place to the place that is held by Alexander the Great to Sarganabaka. Plato and Zarathustra are the bookends for a whole aeon of 2,000 years, just like Alexander the Great and Sargon were bookends for the whole aeon of the political expression. The philosophic comes about 3 generations before the political. The voice is able to say it about 3 generations before the world can put it into operation. So when there's somebody that can speak the truth, it'll be like the grandson generation that'll be able to put it into effect. It's like Shakespeare says, or maybe it's Keats. If winter comes, can spring be far behind? If somebody can say the truth, be sure that their grandchildren are going to be able to live it. Because that's the archetype. And there's no way in the world that the phony sophist can change that. That's what's real. Those are the bones upon which reality happens. Try for next week to read a little bit in the Phaedrus. Try to get this copy of Inanna. And don't look at her descent into the underworld. Look at her marriage with Dumuzi, the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi. And it's kind of sexy, it's kind of erotic, so it may be banned in your neighborhood, I don't know. But go to some area of LA that you can buy dirty books and get a hold of Inanna and read the thing, just about the courtship. Because it's important. Before Inanna can make the descent, she has to be prepared. Because Dumuzi is like a prism, is like the masculine Sibyl, because she's going down the other way. It's like the inverse of the Delphic oracle prophecy. Inanna has to go back through the prism in order to get the focus in the underworld. A man becomes very important to a woman as a prism of her journey towards focusing truth. Other than that, he's a pain. Let's take a break.